This is our quarterly healthcare industry update, just to give you some highlights of interesting, hopefully interesting to me, things that have been going on in the healthcare industry in the very recent months. The period we're covering in this industry update is really from about October of last year until Tuesday. So that's what we're going to be going over. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I might not know the answer, but couldn't hurt to ask. And if you have anything to share too, I mean, I know we have a couple teachers' pets in here who probably know more than I do about a lot of stuff. So by all means, share if you're interested. So our usual agenda is we'll talk about kind of some ongoing issues that are just themes that have been recurring for the past couple of years, notably the opioid crisis and pharma pricing scandals. Then we'll go over general news, some interesting corporate activity, and then the various public sector branches. Cool. So general news, some of our ongoing themes. So the pharma pricing topic that seems to not go away, although the end of last year, it wasn't as in the news as it was the beginning of last year. A couple interesting things that happened were Doctors Without Borders actually protested outside of buildings of some pharmaceutical companies to try and get them to lower their tuberculosis medication costs. Again, tuberculosis is not as big of a deal here, but in third world countries, it's one of the most lethal conditions that we have in the world still, and they are trying to get the price to go from about $2 a day to $1 a day, which is a massive difference in those places. The interesting thing is some tuberculosis treatments are already less than that. But what they're really pushing for is lower prices on the newer ones, which are significantly more effective. Like the newer tuberculosis treatments are the ones that they're talking about, and that's like 80% cure rate as opposed to like 54, 60% for the older drugs. So that's obviously a big deal. The biotech venture capital, a group of biotech venture capital funds have formed a lobbying group called Incubate. And this is interesting because, there's obviously plenty of biotech lobbying presence there, but that's usually directly from those trade organizations, not so much from venture capital. Venture capitalists tend to avoid lobbying in general. The Incubate lobbying group is still very small. It's very new, but given that it's VC, they have plenty of money and influence. They've already scheduled meetings with Nancy Pelosi and stuff like that. They are, they claim to be agnostic politically speaking, from a right-left perspective, but obviously they're a venture capital firm, so they are trying to get as much for themselves as they can, because that's what lobbying is. But they're not opposed to regulation by any means. Martin Shkreli, our famous friend from 4 years ago, which does not seem like it's been that long, but he's been sued by the FTC and the New York Attorney General. In case you don't remember, he's the person who his company bought a patent for a medication, and then he jacked the price up by like 3,000% or something like that, which isn't technically illegal. So that's not what he's being sued for. What he's being sued for is the preamble to that, because if you think about any other business, like if you do that, you're begging for competitors to come in and undercut you. So what he did to avoid having generics come in and undercut his hiked up price was he engaged in some shady practices, and that's what he's being sued for. Stuff like in order for a generic to be made, they have to prove to FDA that they do the same thing as the other drug. And in order to do that, they need the other drug to test on to prove that they're as effective, and he was blocking generic providers from even getting access to the drug to even make a generic, which is illegal. And also, it doesn't matter. So that's what he's being sued for by the FTC and Attorney General. So, oh, go ahead.
I just have a question about pharma pricing. Yep. So there was a bill, my understanding that there's a bill in the House that they're trying to push the pricing of pharma products in the United States down because every other country pays way less, right? Mm-hmm. And so that was going through and pharma's fighting it or trying to fight it. I don't know. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, so the comment is there's my answer is that there are lots of bills. I try to avoid reporting on anything until it's gone a little bit further, because kind of a theme from last year, at the beginning of last year, everyone was certain some huge pharma pricing would be pushed through, and nothing happened last year. And given what 2020 is and will be from a federal government perspective, highly unlikely anything's going to happen this year either. So, but there are proposals, particularly coming from the House, to really minimize costs. But they're all just proposals right now. Yep. Other questions or comments? Awesome. Then there's the opioid crisis. Again, end of the year, there wasn't a lot of activity here, but one thing that's really helpful is the various national academies of like science and engineering and something else. They came out with opioid prescription guidelines. So we've all known that we've been over prescribing and all that. And so up until now, it's mostly just been on individual physicians or institutions to figure out how not to do that. And they've been working to do that, but there's been no industry guidance or higher level guidance. So these national academies released some guidelines and said, here's a good way to approach it. So again, trying to make things more uniform and systematized and give prescribers who want to do the right thing, generally speaking, give them some tools to work with. So that's good. Insys Pharmaceuticals, we talked about them in a few quarters in the past. That is a company that produced and sold a fentanyl spray, which is, fentanyl is one of the most addictive drugs we have. And their trial started earlier this year. The CEO was just sentenced to 66 months in prison, and a couple of the VPs, higher executives, were sentenced to 2 years in prison for specifically for aggressive marketing tactics, despite knowing what the addictive nature of fentanyl and hiding it from the people who are the prescribers, hiding the research. So that's what they got sentenced for. They are not the first pharmaceutical executives to go to prison relating to the opioid crisis, but these are definitely the most high profile and the longest sentences we've seen. To be fair, they were pretty egregious in what they did, so that makes sense. Major pharmaceutical settlement, and this was just a couple, I think just in December. So there have been several kind of large class action multi-state lawsuits about about opioids and suing the creators of OxyContin and all this stuff, and there's multiple states suing multiple companies, and over the past 6 months, in these multi-company suits, companies have been settling independently. So like one company settles and then it will extract itself from the lawsuit. So now it's only like, N-1 companies being sued. And the day before one of these big things was to go to trial, almost all of the companies settled with the state. I believe this was Ohio. Let me double check. Ohio, woo! Yep, so this is the companies that settled were AmerisourceBergen, Cardinal Health, and McKesson. and also the drug maker Teva. There's only 2 defendants remaining in this lawsuit, so probably not going to go forward with it, but who knows? Again, it was the day before we're supposed to go to trial, so. And then there's also another McKesson settlement. This one's interesting because this is the first lawsuit that was brought by investors. So McKesson investors brought a lawsuit against McKesson because they were making these business decisions to push, drugs as from what the investors saw, to do these things that were irresponsible and to mislead doctors. And so the investors, as investors, are holding their McKesson accountable. So it's really the first suit of that nature in regards to the opioid epidemic. And it's anytime you have a success, whether that be a conviction or a settlement, that tends to breed other similar outcomes in the future. So we can definitely see that in addition to states and governments suing companies, now investors can sue companies. I mean, they've always been able to, but now they have. So those are kind of these big trend developments. Again, we're not going to stop hearing about pharmaceutical pricing issues and the opioid crisis, at least in the near future, probably. Next, we'll talk about some interesting R&D developments, or R&Ds. So one that's really cool is the FDA approved the Ebola vaccine. This is the first Ebola vaccine to be approved in the US. Just in November, I think the EU also approved it, so we followed suit. And for lots of reasons, we're probably going to be stockpiling a lot of the vaccine, both for humanitarian reasons and for national security reasons because of chemical warfare. So, so that's approved, and that's great. This is an interesting case that if you, depending on what circles you listen to in the news, there's a drug to combat the most common type of dwarfism called biomarin, and it is controversial because it presumes that dwarfism is a thing to be cured, and there are people who feel genuinely both ways, and they're all good people. But the drug was proven to more or less do what it set out to do, and it's going to the FDA, actually, I think in February for final approval. So that's an interesting new development. It's really the first drug that is able to do anything about well, I mean, there's genetic engineering, but you can't do that in utero, and that's when this stuff is defined. So it's theoretically possible, but this is the first time it's actually been implemented. There's an animal. Hello? Ooh, we got to work on this. All right, so there's a new drug called Axsome. It's an antidepressant. Depression's a very hard to treat condition because sometimes it's chemical, sometimes it's psychological. It's usually both, and about 30% of major depressive diagnoses are resistant to medication. And so Axsome has developed one that they just passed their 3rd stage clinical trial. So it's going to, or rather entered its 3rd stage. It did really well with its 2nd stage. It's does far better than placebo and better than most things that are on the market right now. So that's encouraging because it's a very widespread issue. Really cool thing is there's a startup in Connecticut that's come up with a portable MRI prototype. So MRIs are like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. They take up a whole room. The room itself has to be like encased in copper, otherwise the world explodes. And but this is a portable MRI. It's about the size. It goes like over and around a bed, so you don't even have to have a bed. But it's really about the size of one of these tables in a length, and probably about the size of one of these tables in width too. So it's really interesting. The idea is, aside from just being smaller, which is going to be cheaper, I think they're planning on selling this for about $50,000, which is orders of magnitude cheaper than other MRIs. it might not be great for industrial, like constant usage of hospitals, but it'll be really good for mobile medicine. So a lot of people are at home and can't get to a hospital or even a clinic. And so this is an interesting solution or interesting potential solution for that. Another interesting potential solution is in a hospital in, I think, Florida. Let me double check. You know, I didn't write it down. I think in a hospital in Florida is paired with a company called OnMed to create, they call them telehealth booths. They're like photo booths, but slightly bigger. And inside the booths, there's like a camera and a screen. So it's kind of like your normal telehealth, but the booths are also highly secure, and they can actually dispense medicine from the booth. So it's basically like a combination of a phone booth and a video booth and a dispensary is not the right word, and a vending machine. It's again, we're trying to explore faster healthcare, you know, healthcare as you need it, without burdening the system too much. So it is an interesting element. I mean, I'm a fan of telehealth, but you still do have to go to the pharmacy and whatnot. And this, if it proves useful, and by useful, I mean if people actually use it, because it exists right now, but it's just purely in a pilot. We'll see how much people use it. But that could be another element of getting healthcare to everybody. And again, because it's relatively small, it's also relatively portable. So you could see using that as a way of getting to more disadvantaged areas, or, you know, more dense areas, which are usually the same thing, to get a little bit more healthcare in places it usually isn't already. Questions about any of that? Cool. Some other news, if you've been paying attention, Zyrtec and other related heart medications went through a huge recall at the end of last year. It was discovered or uncovered, depending on who you ask, that they contain a very high level of carcinogens. Again, orders of magnitude. I forget the name of the compound, but the FDA says you're supposed to have like 0.01 unit in your body per year, and if you took this medicine every day, you'd have like 0.88, which is again several orders of magnitude more than what you're supposed to have. So they, like I said, some say it was discovered, some say it was uncovered, and long story short, hopefully you don't take any kind of Zyrtec or Zyrtec related thing. Zantac, sorry, because Zyrtec, did I say Zyrtec? Zantac, because Zyrtec's the allergy one, right? Yeah, Zantac, my apologies. Phew, literally everyone in the room breathes a sigh of relief. Yes, Zantac. So that's a big deal. Another cool thing is Google is partnering. You'll see in this page and also in the future a lot of like big tech companies partnering with healthcare companies, just because, I mean, that's what we do. We understand the idea that a lot of data is very important to get insight. So Google is partnering with Ascension, which is a nonprofit Catholic hospital system it's in about 20 or 21 states, and they're partnering with Ascension to have access to people's medical records so that they can, you know, use big brains and AI to figure out whatever they're trying to figure out. And as Google's want to, they had a fun name for it called Project Nightingale. So you might hear more about that. Similarly, Apple is launching 3 virtual health studies, one about hearing and hearing loss, one about menstruation, and the other is about, what's the other about? Oh, just mobility, like motion using Fitbits. So what's interesting here is Apple is not partnering with anybody to do this. It's purely Apple's own initiative to do these studies. So they're definitely trying to differentiate themselves in many ways, and we'll see what happens. These are open to be signed into in case anybody's curious. Ostensibly, you're able to control what who has access to your data if you sign up. Let's hope that's true. 23andMe, the what do they call it? Consumer genetic company, is partnering with TrialSpark to help. TrialSpark is a startup to help pair people with clinical trials that are appropriate to them. So using their genetic database, they're trying to make the clinical trial pairing a lot more efficient, and because they already know your genes and they already know where you live. So now they have to find people to pair with, and that's where TrialSpark comes in. So that's an interesting use of 23andMe. 23andMe, if you do a little bit of research, is increasingly getting more and more into the healthcare space. Because again, they're what people know them for is you swab your cheek and you find out your ancestry, and they've recently broadened that into you swab your cheek and find out what what your genes might have in store for your health for your future. So it's kind of an obvious progression, but they're sitting on a whole lot of data and a whole lot of genetic data, and there's a lot of value there. So that's 23andMe partnering with TrialSpark. Moderna is partnering with Harvard Medical School. Really, it's specifically about human RNA immunodeficiency research. Moderna is basically just giving Harvard all of their data, both clinical data and research data, and also giving Harvard money to figure out what to do with it. So that's an interesting partnership. And there's always lots of partnerships like this. This one's interesting because Moderna is a publicly traded for-profit company, and that's not often the profile that partners with academia, just because if you're publicly traded, any bad press can really screw you over. And public research that people have access to can fail, and you can't really spin it because it's not under your control. So that's an interesting development. There's the MPM Capital. This is a local venture company, a biotech venture company, and excuse me, and they are actually partnering with the American Association of Cancer Research to create a grant. So this is another new thing. So biotech or venture capital invests in companies, and then they get a piece of that company. And then if the company does well, then the venture capital fund does well. But this is a venture capital fund creating a grant. So it's saying we are just like any grant. Submit your ideas for what you're researching. If we're impressed and believe in you, we will just give you money, no strings attached, because we want the world to be better and yada yada. So this fund has decided to do this, and they're planning on expanding it in the near future. And the fund isn't even in charge of selecting who gets these grants. That's where the American Association of Cancer Research comes in. They do all the vetting and they do the selection, and the fund is just giving the money. So that's very cool. That's MPM Capital here in Boston. Last but not least, in the general news area is Kaiser Permanente has been having a lot of, specifically at the end of last year, has been having a lot of like strikes or threatened strikes. It's in California, so they have a very strong labor presence there. A lot of this came around about last year because California passed some new regulation about transparency of cost and stuff like that. And then it came to light that the CEO of Kaiser Permanente is the most highly paid nonprofit executive in the country. And it was something like $60 million a year, which is, for all CEOs everywhere, not that much, but for nonprofits, it's quite a bit. And so a lot of the workers, particularly, was focused on the health, the mental health part of Kaiser Permanente system, went on strike and or threatened to go on strike. Somewhat interestingly, the CEO of Kaiser Permanente at the end of last year died which was the proximate cause for all of this, died like a day or two before one of the strikes was planned. So long story short, Kaiser has had depending on who you ask, but Kaiser has a very strong reputation in the healthcare field. But this has not been very good press for them for the past 3 or 4 months. And obviously there's some interesting underlying issues about what is a nonprofit and when do you get to not pay taxes and how much do you have to not, anyway, there's lots of discussions there. So that's all kind of the general news. Any questions, comments, concerns, issues, complaints, contradictions? Okay, next we'll talk about some corporate activity. This one's fun. Sean Parker of Napster and Facebook fame, of being played by Justin Timberlake fame. He actually founded a incubator, kind of. It's called the Parker Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy, and they recently helped create this company called Arsenal Bio, and he's planning on through this vehicle doing a lot of investing in particularly immunology. So particularly that'll ultimately focus on cancer because that's kind of what it all focuses on right now. But these advanced biotech ways of targeting diseases. Google's acquiring Fitbit. So however you feel about Google and your data, that will show some things. So Google's acquiring Fitbit, and that basically, if Google and Apple weren't already rivals, that kind of shows that they are even more so than they were, just because Apple's for a while dominated the personal wearable healthcare space, and there's been some contenders, but Google combining its healthcare connections with this most popular wearable kind of shows how they're positioning themselves vis-a-vis Apple. There's a new biotech incubator in Boston. What's it called? Actually, I don't think it has a name yet. So again, this isn't a new type of thing. Incubators exist all around the world, but not a ton that are specifically for high-tech biotech. And this is supposed to really only focus on about 10 companies at a time, and they will total about 300 employees is the idea of that they're focusing on. And there's also another incubator in Boston called Lab Central, and they're doubling their footprint. So they're basically buying a whole new space in, I believe they are, I'm not from Boston. What's the neighborhood Harvard's in? Cambridge. They're Cambridge based, and so they're doubling in size too. So again, a lot of VC, a lot of incubators growing and or starting up in Boston. Another super interesting thing is this new biomanufacturing initiative in Boston. So for the past, this has really become a problem in the past 18 months. So you got pharmaceuticals, right? And you have what they kind of call simple molecule pharmaceuticals, which are, pills, right? That's simple molecule stuff. And we have problems in the manufacturing chain with that, fine. But then there's these biopharmaceuticals that you're working on living cells, you're doing a lot of really advanced stuff there. And so the more complex a thing gets, the crazier the supply chain is, and the more a little inconsistency can completely screw up the supply chain. But we as a species, let's hope, are getting more and more advanced in our medicine. And so we need to really solidify this production of advanced biologics. And so a whole bunch of organizations in and around Boston, and these are, let's see, you know them all, right? MIT, Harvard, GE, the actual Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Beth Israel, Boston Children's Hospital, Brigham Williams, Mass Gen. They're basically saying the supply chain that currently exists isn't good enough. It's just inconsistent. We're not getting the volume we need. So what we're going to do is we're going to create our own supply chain of biologics and these advanced chemicals in Boston, in Massachusetts, and that's an initiative they're all taking, and the idea is to have a facility up and running by 2022. So that's pretty aggressive, and probably, if it works, it's probably going to be good for Massachusetts, because not only will we be kind of the knowledge base of healthcare, but we could also, continue to be the manufacturing base of healthcare. Questions about any of that? Cool. All right, on to the public sector. So let's talk about some stuff the executive branch has been up to. It's actually had a very active, it's had a very active Q4 last year. So these first two pair very well. So Department of Health and Human Services sued Gilead Pharmaceuticals over these two these are two medications related to HIV and HIV prevention. They're called PrEP drugs, preventative prophylactics, I think. They're called, anyway, PrEP drugs. And the idea was the federal government helped these companies develop these drugs. The federal government holds some of the patents it contends to these drugs. And Gilead has been very hesitant to negotiate reduced costs. So I have some numbers for you. So when the FDA first approved these, a month's supply was $650, and now it's like $1,200, right? So it's double the cost, and they're still the same drugs as about 10 years ago. So the idea is they're trying to get the costs lowered, and they're suing Gilead over their fight against that. So that was at the end of last year. What's interesting is the middle of last year in May, Gilead agreed to partner with the Department of Health and Human Services to provide this PrEP medication, enough for 200,000 people for 11 years, just for free. So Gilead is simultaneously working with the Department of Health and Human Services to provide this HIV prevention regimen to people who don't have health insurance, but also the Department of Health and Human Services is suing Gilead over what got us here in the first place. So that's a fun situation. We have a new FDA commissioner, Stephen Hahn. If you attended some of last year's sessions, you knew that the previous FDA commissioner resigned early last year, and then we had an interim FDA commissioner from around March until October, and when Stephen Hahn stepped in. He's never served a public office before. He comes from the private sector, but he's a very celebrated oncologist and researcher. So it will be interesting to see what he does from a public service perspective, because he's new to that. FDA has introduced some new regulation for e-cigarette makers. And again, for the past 12 months, this has been a big thing for the FDA. For the e-cigarette makers, they're actually, draconian is not the right word, but they're getting pretty tough on them. So basically, in order to get FDA approval, not only does an e-cigarette maker have to submit, all the studies of how healthy or unhealthy cigarettes are, but they also are going to have to submit their marketing plans. And if their marketing plans don't include how to, in normal human terms, how to not get kids hooked onto nicotine, then FDA might say you're not approved. So they are expanding the role of what gets you approved or not beyond just clinical trials for e-cigarettes. So that's really interesting. They also, and this is the most recent version, because these just were published on Tuesday, so everyone's still chewing through them, but FDA has dropped a whole bunch of regulations on Tuesday, a lot of which surround gene therapy. And just like any kind of regulation, some people are happy about them, some people aren't. The highlights, let's see. Yeah, I mean, so generally people are happy about the products. The most interesting highlight is that in order to ostensibly make the market more competitive and I'm not going to talk about, there's a concept called orphan drugs that is really interesting, and maybe we'll have a definitive university class about it. But in order to combat the problem of orphan drugs, FDA just released this regulation that said if there's a drug on the market that is effective and they have exclusivity, but someone comes up with a drug that is more effective, despite exclusivity, this new drug can come to market. So it made kind of this exception for orphan drugs and for these specifically related to gene therapy. So the idea there is to open it up.
So biosimilar, the orphan drug is the version of biosimilar, is it under the same regulations? Generic drugs, they keep the market without doing all the studies.
Well, this is specific for gene therapies. Okay. So it's exactly, it's the same concept. Yep. Yeah, but these Tuesday's FDA regulations are specifically for gene therapies, not for all orphan drugs and all biosimilars. Yep. Other questions? Cool. So very busy quarter for the executive branch. Not as busy for the legislative branch. I don't know if anybody's been paying attention, but legislative branch has been otherwise occupied for the past 3 months. We mentioned this earlier, there's been lots of bills coming and going. We had a year of promises to change the pharmaceutical industry, and nothing really came of it. A couple interesting things happened at the end of last year as we were pushing bills through to keep the government funded. One thing happened was the Congress changed slightly what the definition of a biologic is, which made some people mad because biologics, normal drugs have a 5-year patent and biologics have a 12-year patent. And so some people argue that expanding the definition of biologic or decreases competition because people get to lock in, you get the idea. So some people didn't like that. However, biologics have kind of a shorter, ostensibly easier roadmap to get out to the public. So that's why the Congress said that they did what they did. One thing that I was surprised by, and frankly a lot of people were surprised by, because there wasn't much lobbying for or against it, was a loophole to a Medicaid rebate, which is again a very interesting and long and complicated thing we're not going to get into. But Medicaid is this partnership between the federal government and the states, right? And there is a rebate program where states and therefore pharmaceutical companies are reimbursed for what the states buy. And a lot of pharmaceutical companies so there's brand name and then there's generic, right? But they have these things called authorized generics. We've talked about this in the past. These things are authorized generics where they're generics of a drug, but say that's the same company that owns the authorized generic and the brand name. And the authorized generic is usually a little bit more expensive than the generic. And so because the authorized generic's more expensive and the generic's cheaper, they get to do math and pretend like they get to be reimbursed for more than they should be because they are using an authorized generic and not a generic. I'll stop talking because everyone's eyes are glazing over, but that loophole was closed. So basically to keep people who have both the brand name and the generic drug under the same company, to keep them from getting paid for both things. Not exactly, but that's the idea. On the state level, a couple interesting things are happening. California, which is usually the state to try new things, California is going to be selling generic drugs. Like it's going to be a thing that the state does. So it's almost it's almost a fun answer to the national debate of like single payer versus whatever. Like, screw single payer, we're making the drugs. So California is going to be trying to do that for a little while. The idea is, if, you know, instead of doing this whole runaround of, you know, let's let Medicaid negotiate more strongly, we're not negotiating with anybody because we're making the thing. The idea is, if that ends up being cheaper than working with a generic company, other states are probably going to copy that, but it might not be, and then ostensibly generic companies will be proven right. Also, related to Medicaid is a few states are trying some new things out. So if you recall with our Medicaid training, Medicaid is run by the states. It has some federal partnership, but it's run by the states, and it's almost always tied to, it's tied to income, right? If you're making under this a much amount, you could qualify for Medicaid, which is free if not cheap, or cheap if not free. However, several states have been asking for what they call work requirements, Medicaid work requirements. You might have heard of this, which basically means if you don't have a job or can't prove you've been looking for a job after X number of months, you get kicked off of Medicaid. 6 states have received approval from the federal government to do this, although I think all of them are being contested in federal appeals courts. As an answer to this, a few different states, oh, that's not MA, that's Montana, my bad. Pennsylvania, Montana, and Louisiana are all trying something different, which is when you sign up for Medicaid, they ask you when you're signing up for Medicaid, do you want to also sign up for a work readiness program where like you take classes and they work on getting you a resume and stuff like that. It's still early to tell if that will yield any results, but the idea, the logic is, or at least the sentiment is, if someone's trying to get a job or someone's very, very poor, all of a sudden not having them have health insurance won't make them less poor and won't make them get a job. That's the idea. So they're hoping that a carrot approach will work rather than the stick approach. Any questions, comments? All right, last but not least is the judicial branch, which means lawsuits. So we talked about Zantac. So going back to the Zantac discussion, there's actually a class action lawsuit around this. This is where some people are alleging that the toxicity of Zantac was known or should have been known, and what's interesting is Zantac has been owned by and or distributed by a lot of different companies. So I'm gonna rattle it off here. So there's GlaxoSmithKline, which created Zantac. Then there's Warner Lambert, there's Pfizer, there's Boehringer Ingram, there's Sanofi. So it basically, because that's how patents work and that's how intellectual property works, it goes from company to company, and all of these companies are now implicated in this class action lawsuit. So we'll see where that goes. There's a trade group called Pharma, which is the pharmaceutical trade advocacy group, that is suing Oregon over recently passed laws. So Oregon has said that for any pharmaceutical company, if they are about to introduce drug hikes, they have to, or price increases, they have to submit why to the state basically, and they need to like wait 60 days after they submit it before they even do their drug hike. And not only do they have to submit why, they also have to submit like manufacturing techniques and that kind of thing to the government. And the idea that the government is proposing is this will introduce some sunshine so that we can see what's going on, hopefully avoid double dealing. But the pharma is arguing that this is like requiring them to disclose trade secrets with no obvious benefit or no defined benefits. So that's their argument there. We have several CBD class action lawsuits. The whole concept of supplements being sued for claiming to do things they can't do is not new, although it is on the rise. What's interesting is CBD is in a gray space of legality right now. So like, it's one thing to sue a vitamin company for saying that it makes you 10 feet taller, but that's because vitamins are legal, but they're doing an illegal marketing thing. What we don't know is there even, where even is the jurisdiction to sue a CBD company? Because federally, can I sue them federally? Because is it legal federally? Can I sue my drug dealer? No, because the thing they're doing isn't legal in the first place. So anyway, what happens here will actually be interesting, because one way or the other, it's going to force FDA to say something out loud about the legality of cannabinoid products. So keep an eye on that. And they might, and these class action suits might go through. The people suing might win, and we might just see the CBD industry collapse. Like, that is, I don't think I'm being hyperbolic. That's incredibly possible, because it's still a young industry, and so it doesn't have a lot of staying power. It doesn't have a lot of cash and could just come back with. Last but not least, California has recently passed some legislation that is intended to counter pay to delay. We've talked about this in the past too, where if you have a brand name drug and a generic company comes in and they want to sell a generic version of your brand name drug, a practice that is, or a series of practices called pay to delay, are where the company that has a generic drug says, we'll give you, they don't say this, but this is what happens. They give them money or some other kind of valuable asset to delay them from bringing to market that generic drug for another 5 years, basically locking in, having a de facto monopoly even past the patent date. California recently passed several laws to stop that from happening, but the state of California is being sued by several drug manufacturers, both brand name and somewhat surprisingly generic manufacturers, saying that these are legitimate business practices and they should be allowed to do them. And this has already been not shut down. The California legislature's laws were upheld in a federal court, and so now this is going up to an appeals level. My guess is this is going to the Supreme Court probably a year after this one, just because it's a very relevant topic and it's not going away anytime soon. And I think that is everything. So those are the updates for the past few months. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, happy to hear about them. If you come across anything that's interesting that you want to see in these in the future, then by all means, let me know. And hope everybody has a wonderful Friday.